Somewhere over the western Pacific, a satellite the size of a refrigerator registers a flash of heat. It is not much. A thermal bloom against the cold background of the ocean. The kind of signature that would have meant nothing to anyone 30 years ago. The satellite does not think. It forwards. 11 seconds later, a ground station in Colorado has the data. 4 seconds after that, an algorithm has classified the bloom as a probable anti-ship missile launch and flagged its projected flight corridor. 22 seconds in, an E-2D Hawkeye orbiting 300 miles from the launch point picks up the missile on radar and begins feeding its track to every ship in the strike group below. At the 50-second mark, a destroyer that cannot even see the target with its own radar receives firing quality data over the network. At 68 seconds, her vertical launch cells open. At 90 seconds, an SM-6 interceptor is in the air, climbing toward a collision point calculated by machines and approved by a human being who had, in total, about 9 seconds to make the most consequential decision of his watch. This is Battletech Declassified, Modern Warfare Explained. Last episode, we stood at the Strait of Hormuz and watched the most powerful navy in history struggle against mines, drones, and geography. This episode is about the other side of that ledger, the thing the U.S. Navy does better than any force on Earth, the capability that no adversary has matched and every adversary is trying to break. It is called the kill chain, and in its modern American form, it can move from first detection to missile in the air in under 2 minutes. 90 seconds is not a slogan. It is an engineering achievement 4 decades in the making, built from satellites, radar planes, destroyers, datalinks, and software, all fused into a single distributed weapon. This episode takes that weapon apart, link by link, how it finds, how it decides, how it kills. And, because this is Season 5, and this season is about honest answers, where it breaks. Because every link in this chain is also a target. And the countries most likely to fight America have spent 20 years studying exactly which link to cut first. The phrase kill chain sounds like jargon, but the idea underneath it is old and simple, and once you see it, you will recognize it in every war ever fought. To destroy anything, any military in history has had to complete the same sequence of tasks. You have to find the target. You have to fix its position precisely enough to aim at it. You have to track it as it moves. You have to assign a weapon to it. You have to engage, meaning actually fire. And afterward, you have to assess whether you hit it, because if you did not, the sequence starts again. American doctrine compresses this into a string of verbs: find, fix, track, target, engage, assess, and calls the whole sequence the kill chain. A Roman legion completed a kill chain with scouts, runners, and a centurion's shouted order. The sequence has not changed in 2,000 years. What has changed is the speed at which it runs and the distance across which it stretches. Here is why the speed matters more than any individual weapon. In the Falklands War in 1982, Argentine aircraft were sometimes detected by British ships less than 60 seconds before their Exocet missiles struck. The British had superb weapons and well-trained crews, and ships still burned because the chain from detection to decision to engagement could not run fast enough. Every naval engagement since then has been, at its heart, a race between 2 clocks, the attacker's flight time and the defender's decision time. A modern anti-ship cruise missile skimming the waves at high subsonic speed gives a defending ship perhaps 3 to 4 minutes from over-the-horizon launch. A ballistic missile arcing down from space gives less. A hypersonic weapon gives less still. The U.S. Navy looked at that math in the early 2000s and reached a conclusion that reshaped everything it builds. No single ship, however powerful, can win that race alone, because no single radar can see far enough. The only way to buy back time is to make every sensor in the theater work for every shooter in the theater, so that the clock starts not when your own radar sees the threat, but when anyone's does. That single idea, stretching the chain across platforms, is the foundation of everything that follows. Before we go deeper, if this kind of analysis is what you came to YouTube for, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Season 5 is one continuous argument across 12 episodes. Each one builds on the last, and this episode connects directly to what came before at Hormuz and what comes next at Taiwan. Subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it is the single best way to make sure the algorithm keeps this channel alive. Do it now, and let us get back to the chain. The chain begins in orbit. And the orbital layer is the part almost nobody outside the defense world understands correctly. The United States operates, broadly speaking, two kinds of eyes in space. The first kind is the legacy constellation, a small number of large, exquisite, staggeringly expensive satellites in high orbits. The Space-Based Infrared System, SBIRS, watches the entire planet continuously for the heat signature of missile launches from more than 20,000 miles up. These satellites cost billions of dollars each, and they are extraordinary at what they do. But there are only a handful of them, and everyone who might fight America knows exactly where they are. The second kind is new, and it represents one of the most important shifts in American military architecture this century. Instead of a few giant satellites, the Space Development Agency has been launching tranches of small, comparatively cheap satellites into low Earth orbit, hundreds of them, forming a mesh that provides missile tracking and data relay with built-in redundancy. Kill one exquisite satellite, and you blind a hemisphere. Kill one small satellite in a proliferated constellation, and you have removed a pixel from a picture that heals itself. That proliferated layer matters to the 90-second story for a specific reason: latency. A satellite in geosynchronous orbit is far away, and data pathways from it route through a small number of ground stations. A low-orbit mesh passes data laterally, satellite to satellite by laser link, and drops it to theater users in seconds. When the thermal bloom of a launch appears, the question that decides the entire engagement is how fast that detection becomes a track in the combat system of a ship 400 miles away. In the 1991 Gulf War, satellite detection of Scud launches took so long to reach shooters that the missiles had usually landed first. Today, the same class of detection arrives before the threat finishes its boost phase. The chain's first link has been compressed from tens of minutes to tens of seconds, and every subsequent link inherits that head start. The second layer of the finding function flies at 60,000 feet and looks like a business jet with a canoe strapped underneath. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, uncrewed platforms like the Triton, and a fleet of aircraft whose designations rarely appear in press releases maintain what planners call persistent stare over the water spaces where a fight would happen. But the aircraft that matters most to the Navy's 90-second chain is older, slower, and propeller-driven, and it may be the single most important aircraft in the entire United States fleet. It is the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, and if the kill chain has a quarterback, this is it. The Hawkeye is not a fighter. It carries no missiles. It is a flying radar station and battle management office with a crew of 5 orbiting high above the strike group, and its radar can detect and track targets, including small, low-flying cruise missiles, at ranges that ships' own radars cannot match, because the Hawkeye's altitude lets it see over the curve of the Earth. The curvature of the Earth is the quiet villain of every naval air defense story, and it is worth pausing on, because once you understand it, the entire architecture makes sense. A ship's radar, mounted perhaps 150 feet above the waterline, cannot see a sea-skimming missile until that missile crosses the radar horizon, roughly 20 to 25 miles out. A missile traveling 600 miles an hour covers that distance in about 2 minutes. That is the entire engagement window a lone ship gets, 2 minutes, and much of it is consumed by radar confirmation, track establishment, and human decision. Now raise the sensor to 25,000 feet aboard a Hawkeye. The radar horizon leaps outward by hundreds of miles. The same missile is now detected not 2 minutes from impact, but 15 or 20. The Hawkeye does not just see farther, it manufactures time, and time is the only currency the kill chain actually spends. Everything else in this episode, the networks, the interceptors, the software, exists to convert that manufactured time into a missile in the air. Down on the water, the shooter end of the chain is built around a system whose name you have heard, Aegis, and a radar whose name you probably have not, Spy-6. Aegis is not a weapon. It is a combat system, the software and hardware brain that fuses radar data, manages tracks, computes firing solutions, and sequences launches aboard American cruisers and destroyers. It entered service in the early 1980s, and it has been continuously rebuilt ever since, to the point where a modern Aegis baseline shares almost nothing with its ancestor except the name and the philosophy. The philosophy is automation with human supervision. Aegis was designed from the beginning around a brutal insight from the missile age that saturation attacks would arrive faster than human operators could handle manually, and that the machine must therefore be able to run the engagement sequence itself, with humans setting the rules and holding the veto. The newest destroyers carry the SPY-6 radar, and the generational leap it represents is difficult to overstate. SPY-6 is roughly 30 times more sensitive than the radar it replaces. It can track ballistic missiles and low-flying cruise missiles simultaneously, discriminate real warheads from decoys at long range, and resist jamming that would have degraded its predecessor. But the most important thing about SPY-6 in the context of the 90-second chain is not its power, it is its role as a node. For most of naval history, a ship's radar existed to serve that ship's weapons. The radar saw, the ship shot. SPY-6, like the Hawkeye's radar above it, feeds everything it sees into the shared network, where its tracks are fused with everyone else's into a single composite picture. A destroyer in the outer screen becomes an extension of the carrier's defense. A radar picture built by 5 ships and 2 aircraft becomes sharper, harder to jam, and impossible to fool with any single decoy, because the network sees the target from multiple angles at once. The ship stopped being a fortress and became a cell in an organism. The organism has a nervous system, and its name is Cooperative Engagement Capability, CEC. If there is one piece of technology in this episode that deserves to be famous and is not, this is it. CEC is a network that does something deceptively simple sounding. It shares raw radar measurement data between ships and aircraft in real time, not processed summaries, not verbal reports. The actual sensor measurements themselves, fused into a single composite track picture that every participant sees identically and simultaneously. The distinction between sharing summaries and sharing measurements sounds technical, but it is the difference between a group of people describing a bird to each other over the phone and a group of people all looking through the same pair of binoculars. With CEC, when the Hawkeye sees a missile that a destroyer cannot, the destroyer does not receive a warning about the missile. The destroyer receives the missile as a firing quality track in its own combat system, as if its own radar were seeing it. That capability unlocked the tactic that collapsed the kill chain's timeline, and the Navy calls it engage on remote. A destroyer can now launch an interceptor at a target it has never seen with its own sensors, guiding the missile on data supplied entirely by another platform. The launch no longer waits for the shooter's own radar horizon. In testing that began a decade ago, and in fleet exercises since, an SM-6 fired from a ship has destroyed targets over the horizon, targets the launching ship was physically incapable of detecting, using tracking data relayed from an E-2D flying far away. Think about what that means for the geometry of a battle. The old limit, the 25-mile radar horizon, is gone. The defended zone around a carrier group is no longer a circle drawn by any ship's radar. It is a shape drawn by the combined vision of every sensor in the theater, and a threat entering that shape from any direction can be engaged by whichever shooter holds the best firing position. Regardless of which sensor found it, the chain stopped living inside one hull. It now lives in the network, and the network is why 90 seconds is possible. If the picture forming in your head right now is starting to feel like something out of science fiction that is actually flying and sailing today, hit the like button. It genuinely matters. It tells the platform that long, serious military analysis deserves an audience, and it costs you nothing. Like the episode, and if someone you know still thinks naval warfare is about ships shooting at what they can see, send them this one. Now we need to talk about the missile itself, because the weapon at the end of the chain shapes everything behind it. The Standard Missile 6, SM-6, is the closest thing the U.S. Navy has to a universal answer. It was designed as a fleet air defense interceptor, but it has grown into something stranger and more valuable, a single missile that can destroy aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles in their final descent, and, in a capability the Navy spent years hinting at before confirming, enemy ships. One airframe, one supply chain, one set of launch cells, covering missions that used to require 4 different weapons. Its guidance is the key to its role in the 90-second chain. The SM-6 carries an active radar seeker derived from the AMRAAM air-to-air missile, meaning it can hunt in the terminal phase on its own, without requiring the launching ship to illuminate the target with a dedicated fire control radar all the way to impact. Launch it toward a point in space on network data, and it finishes the job itself. That self-sufficiency is what makes engage on remote work, and it is also what makes the missile expensive. Each SM-6 costs roughly $4.3 million, and as we established last episode, production runs at only about 500 a year. Those two numbers hang over this entire episode like weather. The kill chain can find a target in seconds and put a missile on it in 90, but every pull of that trigger spends $4 million and 1/500th of a year's production. Against a peer adversary launching salvos of cheap weapons mixed with expensive ones, the chain's speed is not the constraint, the magazine is. The Navy knows this, which is why the same vertical launch cells increasingly carry a mixed loadout. Cheaper ESSM interceptors quad-packed 4 to a cell for closer threats, SM-2S for the middle tier, SM-6 reserved for the shots only it can take. The chain does not just decide when to shoot, it decides what to shoot, and matching the cheapest sufficient weapon to each threat is as much a part of the 90 seconds as the radar tracks are. There is a 5th-generation wrinkle in the sensor story, and it changes the geometry again. The F-35, whatever you think of its cost history, is the most capable flying sensor the Navy and Marine Corps have ever put over water. Its radar, its infrared search system, and its electronic surveillance suite hoover up information across the spectrum, and its sensor fusion presents all of it as a single clean picture. More importantly for the kill chain, the F-35 is stealthy, which means it can do its looking deep inside contested airspace where a Hawkeye could not survive, loitering quietly near the threat, watching launchers that hide from satellites under camouflage nets and terrain. In multiple demonstrated tests, an F-35 has detected a target and passed its track through the network to a shooter elsewhere, including to Aegis ships and to ground-based launchers, which then killed the target the F-35 found. The stealth fighter becomes a forward scout for missiles it does not carry. The picture you should be assembling by now is not a chain at all, and the Pentagon knows it, which is why the fashionable term inside the building has shifted from kill chain to kill web. A chain is linear, one sensor, one decision, one shooter, and a chain has a defining weakness. Cut any link, and the whole thing fails. A web is redundant. In the web, the satellite, the Hawkeye, the destroyer's Spy-6, and the F-35 may all hold the same target simultaneously, and any of several shooters may take it. A destroyer's SM-6, a fighter's own missile, in the emerging architecture even an Army launcher ashore. The Pentagon's umbrella program for this, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC2, with the Navy's contribution called Project Overmatch, aims to make target data flow between any sensor and any shooter in any service automatically. The ambition is enormous, and the engineering is unfinished. Service networks still speak different dialects, bandwidth is finite, and software integration moves slower than press releases. But the direction is set, and the 90-second chain we are describing in this episode is best understood as the naval strand of a web that is still being woven. We have arrived at the moment in the chain where the machinery stops and a human being enters. And this is the part of the episode where I want you to slow down and really picture the scene. Because everything we have described so far exists to serve the next 9 seconds. The place is the Combat Information Center of a destroyer, a cold, dark room in the heart of the ship, lit mostly by screens. The air smells like coffee and electronics. A tactical action officer, often a lieutenant in their late 20s, sits at a console with authority delegated from the captain to fight the ship's defensive battle. The network has done its work. A track has appeared, classified hostile, speed and trajectory consistent with an anti-ship missile, time to impact now under 3 minutes. Aegis has already computed the intercept solution, selected the launch cell, and is presenting its recommendation. The system is asking, in effect, may I? What happens next depends on a decision made long before the doctrine setting of the combat system. In manual mode, the human approves every engagement. In automated modes, reserved for the highest threat environments, Aegis will fire on its own against threats matching strict parameters, and the human supervises with a veto. The Navy has run real engagements under exactly this pressure in the Red Sea, where destroyers like the USS Carney and USS Gravely shot down ballistic missiles and drones fired at shipping and at themselves, sometimes with engagement windows measured in seconds. the tightest margins American warships have faced since the Second World War. Officers who stood those watches have described the experience in congressional testimony and interviews. The track appears, the recommendation blinks, and there is no time to convene anyone. The entire chain, satellites, Hawkeyes, radars, network, missile, compresses into one young officer's judgment exercised in less time than it took you to listen to this sentence. 90 seconds is a machine achievement. The last 9 belong to a person, and the Navy trains that person's judgment as deliberately as it engineers any radar. How do you train a judgment that fast? And how do you make it safe to delegate? The answer is one of the least glamorous and most important stories in the modern Navy, and it happens years before any deployment. Tactical action officers qualify through a pipeline of simulation that borders on the theatrical full-crew scenarios run in shore-based replicas of the Combat Information Center, where instructors inject ambiguity on purpose. A contact that looks hostile but is an airliner with a broken transponder. A friendly fighter returning with damaged identification gear. A missile launch buried inside a stream of radar clutter and jamming. The crews are graded not just on speed but on restraint, because the history that haunts this training has a name: the USS Vincennes, which in 1988 shot down an Iranian airliner over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 people after a chain of human errors under pressure misidentified it as an attacking fighter. Every piece of automation and every rule of engagement since carries the fingerprints of that day. The rules of engagement themselves are the invisible software of the kill chain, and they are written with the precision of contract law. They define what constitutes hostile intent, what evidence suffices, who may declare a track hostile, and under what conditions the ship may fire without higher approval. In peacetime transit, the thresholds sit high, and the humans stay deep in the loop. In a declared high-threat environment, commanders push authority downward and open the automated doctrines, accepting more machine autonomy in exchange for survival against saturation. This dial between human control and machine speed is not a technical setting. It is a command decision about acceptable risk in both directions: the risk of shooting something you should not, and the risk of dying because you hesitated. The 90-second chain is fast because someone, somewhere, decided in advance exactly how much judgment could be delegated to a machine and a lieutenant. That decision, more than any radar specification, is what the next war will test. Let us watch the whole chain run once, end to end, in a single engagement, because assembled pieces mean more than parts. Picture the Western Pacific again, a surface action group, 3 destroyers, operating under emissions control. Radars silent to stay hidden, listening instead of shouting. 200 miles away, a mobile launcher on a coastline fires an anti-ship ballistic missile. Second 0, the boost plume blooms hot against the cold earth, and a low-orbit tracking satellite catches it. Seconds 2 through 10, the detection crosses the space mesh by laser link and drops into the theater network, where fusion software matches the plume to a known launcher type and generates a predicted trajectory. Seconds 11 through 25, the E-2D 300 miles from the launch point slews its radar to the predicted corridor and acquires the missile as it climbs, its track now firing quality, flowing through CEC to every ship in the group. Seconds 26 through 50, aboard the nearest destroyer, Aegis correlates the network track, computes intercept geometry, and recommends engagement, while the ship's own Spy 6 remains dark, giving the enemy no radar signature to home on. Seconds 51 through 60, the tactical action officer, authority pre-delegated for exactly this threat class, evaluates and approves. Seconds 61 through 90, launch. A hatch on the forward deck vents flame. An SM-6 climbs on a pillar of smoke, tips over, and accelerates downrange, steered by network data toward a basket in the sky where its own seeker will wake and hunt. The destroyer that fired never saw the target with its own eyes, and never will. Somewhere in the upper atmosphere, minutes later, 2 objects meet at a closing speed measured in miles per second. The chain then does the thing everyone forgets. It assesses. Satellites in the Hawkeye confirming the intercept debris, because if the warhead survived, the sequence must instantly run again with a second missile already spun up. That is the 90-second kill chain. Not one machine, but a choreography of a dozen, rehearsed until it moves like reflex. Now we turn the telescope around. Because this season is called How America Fights, and no honest episode about the kill chain can pretend that only America has one. China has spent 25 years building its own, aimed at one target set above all others, American aircraft carriers. And understanding the Chinese chain is the only way to understand the next war's opening hours. The People's Liberation Army calls its governing concept systems destruction warfare, and its logic is a mirror of everything we have described. Ocean surveillance satellites in growing constellations watch the Pacific. Over-the-horizon radars, the size of city blocks, stare across thousands of miles of ocean from mainland China, bouncing signals off the ionosphere to detect ship formations far beyond the horizon. Maritime militia vessels and fishing fleets report positions. All of it feeds targeting for the weapons the entire architecture exists to serve. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, advertised as carrier killers, able to strike moving ships at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 miles. The honest technical assessment is that hitting a moving carrier with a ballistic missile is monstrously hard, and hardness is the entire American counter-strategy. The missile's flight takes 10 to 15 minutes. In that time, a carrier moving at 30 knots displaces itself by miles. So the Chinese chain must keep updating the missile's aim point mid-flight, which requires continuous tracking, which requires satellites and radars and data links functioning under attack. Every link that makes the American chain fast is, on the Chinese side, a link America plans to cut, blinding satellites, jamming links, deceiving seekers with decoys and electronic ghosts. Both fleets have therefore arrived at the same strange truth from opposite directions. The next Pacific War will not open with ships shooting at ships. It will open with each side attacking the other's ability to see, because in a world of 90-second chains, the fleet that loses its eyes loses everything else within hours. The duel is not missile against ship. It is chain against chain. So how do you break a kill chain? Start with the softest attack, electronic warfare, because it is invisible, deniable, and cheap. Every link we have described communicates by radio, radar, or data link, and anything that radiates can be jammed, and anything that receives can be lied to. Jamming is the blunt instrument, flooding a radar's frequency with noise until real echoes drown, saturating a data link until the network stutters. The counter is frequency hopping, power, and directional antennas, and the counter to the counter is more sophisticated jamming, a spiral both sides have climbed for 80 years. Spoofing is the scalpel. Instead of noise, the attacker transmits plausible lies, false radar echoes that look like ships, phantom aircraft tracks injected into a picture, GPS signals subtly wrong so that a weapon or a ship believes itself somewhere it is not. The Russians have spoofed GPS across whole regions around their operations for years. Commercial ships in the Black Sea have found themselves electronically teleported to airports miles inland. Against the American web, the electronic attack problem is harder than against a single ship, and that is by design. CEC fuses measurements from radars in different locations on different frequencies, so a spoofer must tell every sensor a geometrically consistent lie simultaneously, which is close to impossible. One reason the network architecture was worth its billions. But the web has its own soft spots. Bandwidth is physical, satellite links have finite capacity, and a theater's worth of censored data is enormous. So a smart adversary attacks not the sensors, but the plumbing between them, forcing the web to degrade into disconnected islands, at which point each island is just a lone ship again with a 25-mile horizon. The Navy trains explicitly for this, fighting in what it calls emissions control and degraded communications, crews practicing the awful arithmetic of a battle where the network flickers. The 90-second chain assumes the network lives. Every serious adversary's opening move is to kill it. Above the jamming sits a blunter threat, the war against the eyes themselves, and it begins in orbit. China demonstrated a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon in 2007, shattering one of its own dead weather satellites and scattering thousands of debris fragments that low orbit will carry for decades. Russia has tested its own interceptors, most recently in 2021, and both countries field a quieter arsenal that worries American planners more than missiles do. Ground-based lasers that can dazzle imaging satellites, jammers that target the links between satellites and Earth, and inspection satellites that maneuver close to others in orbit. officially for maintenance, practically as rehearsals. The logic is straightforward and cold. If the American kill chain starts with a satellite seeing a launch, then the cheapest way to defeat every destroyer in the Pacific at once is to make sure nothing in orbit sees anything at all. This is precisely why the proliferated constellation strategy we described in Segment 3 exists, and why it may be the most consequential procurement decision of the decade. Killing a handful of billion-dollar satellites with a handful of interceptors is a viable opening move. Killing 400 small satellites requires 400 interceptors, each launch a visible act of war, each intercept adding debris that threatens the attacker's own constellation. And the mesh degrades gracefully, instead of failing catastrophically, coverage thinning rather than vanishing. The Space Development Agency's tranches launch on a cadence unheard of in military space, dozens of satellites at a time, refreshed every 2 years, deliberately cheap, deliberately numerous, deliberately replaceable. The American bet is that resilience through numbers beats exquisiteness through engineering, the same lesson the drone war taught at Hormuz, applied 100 miles up. Whether the bet pays depends on a race in progress right now, between how fast America can thicken the mesh and how fast its adversaries can build weapons that thin it. The first battle of the next great power war will very likely be silent, in vacuum, and over within hours. And most of the world will not know it happened until the news arrives that the Pacific Fleet has gone quiet. We are halfway through, so let us take stock, because the two halves of this episode are mirror images. In the first half, we built the chain, satellites that catch a launch plume in seconds, the Hawkeye manufacturing time from altitude, SPY-6 and Aegis fusing the picture, CEC letting any shooter fire on anyone's data, the SM-6 finishing the job on its own seeker, and a human being spending 9 trained seconds on the only decision machines are not allowed to make. 90 seconds from detection to launch, the fastest sensor-to-shooter loop any Navy has ever fielded. And in the last 2 segments, we started taking it apart the way an adversary would, jamming the links, spoofing the picture, and blinding the satellites where the whole sequence begins. If this episode has earned it so far, this is the moment. Hit like, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because the second half is where the comfortable part ends. Everything we have described so far is a duel of machines. What comes next is the part the machines cannot fix. The production lines that cannot keep up, the hypersonic weapons compressing 90 seconds into a window too small for humans, the lessons Hormuz taught about clutter and cheap swarms, and the question that hangs over the whole season, whether the most sophisticated kill chain in history is actually built for the war it is most likely to fight. Subscribe and let us find out. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The 90-second chain conceals. Speed is not the same as depth, and the Red Sea proved it in front of the whole world. Between late 2023 and the ceasefire periods that followed, American destroyers performed magnificently. By every tactical measure, hundreds of drones and missiles intercepted, no warship lost. Engagement windows tighter than any since 1945 handled without a single catastrophic error. The kill chain worked, and while it worked, it consumed. The Navy fired more Standard missiles in months than the industrial base builds in years. $4 million interceptors, erasing $50,000 drones, night after night, week after week. The chain won every engagement and lost the exchange rate on every one of them. An admiral can love that math for one deployment. A nation cannot survive it for one war. The deeper problem is that magazine depth is not something the chain can route around, because vertical launch cells cannot be reloaded at sea. A destroyer that empties its 96 cells must sail to a port with a crane, and in a Pacific war those ports are days away and themselves under missile threat. The Navy is experimenting with reload-at-sea systems, but the physics of lowering a 40-foot missile canister into a pitching deck cell has defeated engineers for decades. So the operational reality is stark. Every SM-6 spent against a cheap drone is a cell that will not hold an interceptor when the ballistic salvo comes. This is why Segment 7's point about mixed loadouts matters so much, why lasers and microwave weapons from last episode's Hormuz story are not luxuries but survival requirements, and why the Pentagon's budget fights over interceptor production lines are, without exaggeration, more important to the next war's outcome than any decision about how many ships to build. The chain decides in 90 seconds. The magazine it draws from was decided 5 years earlier in a procurement document nobody televised. Now compress the clock, because the adversary weapons arriving this decade are aimed not at the ships, but at the 90 seconds themselves. Hypersonic weapons, gliders and cruise missiles sustaining speeds above Mach 5 while maneuvering, attack the chain's arithmetic at every link. A ballistic missile is fast but predictable. Its arc computable from boost, which is what lets Aegis fire on a basket in space with confidence. A hypersonic glider skips and weaves along the top of the atmosphere, too low for the long-range radars that watch space, too fast for the picture to stabilize, its trajectory a question mark until terminal descent. Detection windows shrink from 15 minutes toward 5 or 3. Track quality degrades. The intercept basket blurs. And the human decision window, our 9 seconds in the dark room, gets squeezed toward a number where the honest answer is that no human fits inside it at all. Both China and Russia have fielded early hypersonic systems, and Russia has fired several types into Ukraine, with results that cut both ways. Patriot batteries have intercepted weapons advertised as unstoppable, but only at close range, in defense of point targets, with seconds to spare. For the Navy, the response runs through everything this episode is built, plus one addition, moving the intercept earlier. The proliferated satellite mesh exists substantially because tracking hypersonic gliders from low orbit continuously along their whole flight is the only way to rebuild the time the weapon steals. The SM-6 in its newest blocks is being adapted as a terminal hypersonic interceptor, and a sea-based glide phase interceptor is in development to hit the weapons mid-flight before terminal maneuvering begins. But notice what has happened to our 90 seconds. Against the fastest threats, the chain must now complete detection, fusion, decision, and launch in a fraction of that time, and the fraction keeps shrinking. The chain's next generation is being designed for a clock on which humans are the slowest component, and that fact leads directly into the hardest question of this season. The question is autonomy, and it deserves plain language rather than slogans. The kill chain already contains machine autonomy. It has for 40 years. Aegis, in its automated doctrine, will launch without a human keystroke. The phalanx gun on every warship engages incoming missiles entirely on its own logic, because, at 2 miles and Mach 2, there is no meaningful alternative. The line the U.S. Navy has held is that machines may execute engagements against clearly defined threat classes under rules a human set in advance and can revoke, while humans make the judgment calls, the ambiguous track. The escalation decision, the shot that starts a war rather than finishes an attack. The pressure of the shrinking clock pushes against that line every year. When the inbound is hypersonic, and the window is 4 seconds, keeping a human in the loop means, functionally, choosing not to defend the ship. Keeping a human on the loop, supervising with veto power, becomes the realistic ceiling of control. The Pentagon's answer so far is a layered doctrine, tightening machine autonomy around defense, weapons protecting a ship from incoming fire while holding human authority over offense, weapons that go find things and kill them. Software like the systems descended from Project Maven now processes targeting imagery and recommends, but the release authority remains human, and official policy requires appropriate human judgment over the use of force. The honest complication is the adversary's choice. Chinese military writing on intelligentized warfare openly explores deeper autonomy in targeting, and in a chain-against-chain duel, the side whose loop runs at machine speed throughout holds an advantage, measured in exactly the seconds this episode is about. Episode 10 of this season takes this dilemma on in full: the AI soldier, the algorithm that kills, and who answers for it. For now, hold this thought. The 90-second chain was built to give humans time to decide. The next decade of weapons is being built to take that time away, and the most consequential arms race of our era may be over who is willing to remove the human first. Bring the story back to the water we started this season on, because Hormuz stress-tested the kill chain in ways the Pacific scenarios never modeled, and the lessons are still being absorbed. The chain was designed against the hardest targets: ballistic arcs, supersonic sea skimmers, the clean geometry of missile against missile. What the Persian Gulf served up instead was clutter. Hundreds of contacts in a 4-mile channel, fishing dhows and tankers and ferries, and inside that mess, IRGC fast boats indistinguishable from fishermen until the moment they were not, and drones with radar signatures smaller than seabirds, slow, low, and cheap. The exquisite sensors saw everything, which was precisely the problem. A picture with 1,000 contacts and 3 threats is, for a human operator, sometimes worse than a picture with nothing. And the Vincennes ghost sits in every operator's mind when the ambiguous contact turns toward the ship. The chain adapted, and the adaptations preview the next decade. Classification became the bottleneck rather than detection, so the fusion software absorbed new behavioral models, wake patterns, speed profiles, the difference between a dow's drift and an attack run. Machine judgment, easing the human load, one recommendation at a time. Cheap threats demanded cheap answers, so the loadout logic sharpened. Guns and ESSMs and electronic attack forward, SM-6 held back. And the laser experiments from last episode moved up the priority list with real urgency behind them. And commanders relearned an old lesson with new tools. That in cluttered water, the chain's greatest asset is not its speed, but its memory. The network tracking every contact continuously for days. So that the boat that loitered near the shipping lane on Tuesday is already flagged when it accelerates on Friday. The 90-second chain born for the open Pacific is being retrained by the crowded littorals, and the version that emerges from that education is the one Taiwan's waters will meet. There is a layer of the chain we have mentioned only in passing, and it deserves its own segment because wars are increasingly decided there, the software layer and the unglamorous machinery of integration. Every capability in this episode, engage on remote, composite tracking, automated doctrine, is ultimately code, millions of lines of it. Written across decades by contractors who sometimes competed with each other, running on hardware generations apart, aboard ships that update their combat systems in shipyard availabilities years apart. The result is that the fleet at sea is never one kill chain. It is a patchwork of Aegis baselines and software versions, and a capability demonstrated triumphantly in a test can take a decade to reach every hull. The Navy's push toward what it calls an integrated combat system, one software backbone updated continuously across the fleet, the way a phone updates overnight, is arguably the most important modernization program you will never see a headline about. The same is true of the Joint Seams. The Navy's web speaks CEC and Link 16. The Air Force's speaks its own dialects. The Army's launchers ashore arrive with another. And Allied fleets, Japanese Aegis destroyers, Australian ships, British carriers bring their own versions and their own release rules. Every seam is latency, and every latency is seconds, and this episode has established what seconds are worth. The exercises that matter most in the Pacific right now are not the photogenic carrier formations, but the plumbing tests. A U.S. satellite cueing a Japanese radar, cueing an American destroyer, an Army battery ashore killing a maritime target on Navy data. Each seam crossed cleanly as a rehearsal for the war plan's central assumption that the coalition can fight as one web rather than 5 chains. Episode 9 of this season, on AUKUS, returns to this, because the deepest thing America shares with its closest allies is not submarine technology. It is access to the web itself, and access to the web is access to the 90 seconds. Let us talk about the assess link, the last verb in the chain and the one everyone forgets, because it turns out to be the hardest, and its difficulty shapes wars. Confirming a kill sounds trivial. The missile hit or it did not, but consider what confirmation requires at 400 miles. The intercept happens in the upper atmosphere as a cloud of debris moving at orbital-class speeds. Radar sees fragments, but was the warhead among them? Or did it survive and continue while a decoy died in its place? Satellites see the flash, but infrared confirms an explosion, not a result. In the seconds after an engagement, the chain must decide whether to spend a second $4 million interceptor on the same track, and against a salvo, every unnecessary second shot is a missile stolen from the next threat. Assessment under time pressure is a probability judgment made on fragments of evidence, and it is one of the places where the fusion software earns its keep or fails. Against land targets, the assessment problem gets harder still, and it connects this episode to a pattern as old as air power. In 1991, coalition aircraft flew hundreds of sorties hunting Iraqi Scud launchers and confirmed, after the war, essentially 0 kills, the launchers fired, drove away, and hid. while pilots destroyed decoys and empty trucks. The mobile target problem. Find a vehicle, kill it before it moves, confirm it is actually dead, has humiliated every kill chain ever built, and it is precisely the problem a Taiwan scenario poses at scale, because China's anti-ship missiles ride on trucks designed to shoot and scoot. The modern answer is persistence. Satellites revisiting every few minutes instead of hours, drones loitering for days, algorithms flagging the truck that moved. But persistence produces its own flood, imagery beyond any human staff's capacity, which is why the assess link, more than any other, is being handed to machines. The chain's first verb and last verb, find and assess, have quietly become the same technology, and both now belong mostly to software. Step back now and look at what the chain costs, because Season 5 keeps a ledger, and the ledger explains American strategy better than any doctrine document. The proliferated satellite mesh runs to billions per tranche. An E-2D Hawkeye is roughly $250 million, a Flight 3 destroyer with Spy 6 above $2 billion, an F-35 around $80 to $100 million depending on variant, each SM-6 $4.3 million. And the software integration binding them together consumes billions more across decades. The full 90-second chain, priced honestly, is a $100 billion organism. Its adversary counterpart at Hormuz was a drone built in a workshop and a mine designed decades ago. The exchange rate problem from Episode 1 is not a footnote to the kill chain story. It is the environment the chain lives in, and the reason cost per shot has become as important a specification as range or speed. And yet the ledger has another column, the one that explains why America keeps paying. The chain is expensive because it is a substitute for something more expensive, mass. China builds warships faster than the United States by an enormous margin, and no realistic American shipbuilding surge closes that gap this decade. The American bet, visible in every program this episode has touched, is that a smaller fleet that sees first, decides first, and shoots first, defeats a larger fleet that is still assembling its picture. That 90 seconds of advantage, multiplied across every engagement of a war, substitutes for the hulls America cannot build in time. It is a rational bet, and it echoes bets that worked before, radar, over the channel in 1940. But it concentrates national security into a single quality, the integrity of the web. And it means the entire American position in the Pacific rests on winning the chain-against-chain duel of the opening days. That is not a criticism. It is simply what the money says, and this season takes the money seriously. The chain is also evolving outward, into platforms with no one aboard, and this is where the next 5 years get genuinely strange. The Navy is fielding unmanned surface vessels, medium and large, designed to sail with strike groups or alone, carrying sensors and, in the larger designs, vertical launch cells. Floating magazines and radar pickets that extend the web without risking a crew. Under the water, extra-large unmanned submarines are in trials for missions nobody details on the record. In the air, the carrier wing is adding the MQ-25 tanker first, with armed collaborative combat aircraft behind it, drones flying as loyal wingmen to crewed fighters, forward sensors and missile trucks taking the risks stealth fighters should not. Every one of these platforms is, in kill chain terms, the same thing. Another node, another set of eyes, another cell of the magazine, pushed closer to the threat than a crude hull could justify going. The picket roll deserves emphasis because it recycles one of the most painful lessons in the U.S. Navy's memory. At Okinawa in 1945, the fleet stationed destroyers in a ring far from the carriers as radar pickets, early warning against kamikazes, and those pickets absorbed the worst of the storm. Dozens sunk or shattered, crews paying with their lives to buy the fleet minutes of warning. The unmanned picket is that concept resurrected, with the sacrifice subtracted. A hull deliberately placed where the missiles will arrive first, whose loss costs money instead of men, whose radar dies transmitting and is replaced by the next one off the production line. Attritable is the bureaucratic word, a thing designed to be lost affordably. The kill chain of 2030 will be built substantially from attritable pieces, drones in orbit, drones on the water, drones under it, arranged so the expensive, crude, irreplaceable core sits at the center of a web whose outer strands are meant to break. Hormuz taught the cost of exquisite scarcity. The web's answer is expendable abundance. There is a human story running under all this hardware, and it is changing what it means to be a naval officer. The watchstanders of the 90-second chain are, functionally, air traffic controllers of violence, managing a picture assembled by machines, supervising engagements executed by machines, training their judgment precisely for the residue of decisions machines are not allowed to make. The Navy's schoolhouses have rebuilt themselves around this reality. Tactical action officer courses running students through hundreds of simulated engagements before they ever hold real authority. Weapons and tactics instructors seeded through the fleet, the way fighter aviation seeded Top Gun graduates after Vietnam, entire careers now built inside the Combat Information Center rather than on the bridge wing. The romantic image of naval command, the captain conning the ship through the storm, has quietly given way to something closer to a surgeon supervising a robotic theater, hands off the instruments, judgment fully on. The Red Sea deployments turned this abstraction into biography. Crews came home in 2024 and 2025, having fought the most sustained naval air defense campaign since the Second World War. Young officers with dozens of real engagements in their records. Sailors who had watched ballistic missiles destroyed on their screens seconds from their own hull. The Navy studied them, and two findings shaped policy. First, the systems worked, doctrine held, no blue-on-blue tragedies, no Vincennes repeated under pressure vastly worse. Second, the humans wore down. Cumulative combat stress in crews who technically were never in a declared war. Alarms at all hours for months. The psychological cost of 9-second decisions repeated nightly. The chain's machinery does not fatigue. Its people do, and a Pacific war would demand this tempo not for months, but potentially for years, from crews that cannot be rotated home because there are not enough hulls behind them. Magazine depth, it turns out, has a human dimension too, and it may be the shallowest magazine of all. Every claim in this episode eventually funnels toward one place. So let us say the name, Taiwan, and preview the collision honestly, because next episode lives there. A Taiwan contingency is the kill chain's design case and its nightmare simultaneously. The design case, because everything, the mesh, the Hawkeyes, engage on remote, the attritable pickets, exists to let a smaller American force blunt a Chinese assault across a 100-mile strait by seeing first and shooting first. The nightmare, because every number in the scenario is hostile. Thousands of Chinese missiles of every class against magazines that count in dozens per hull. Chinese sensors and shooters operating from their own coastline, unsinkable and endlessly reloadable against American nodes at the end of a 7,000-mile supply line. And a clock, the 14-day problem we will define next week, inside which the entire web must survive, fight, and win before the geography hardens into fact. Run the two chains against each other in your mind, because that duel is the actual war. Chinese over-the-horizon radars and satellites hunting American strike groups, American interceptors and jammers hunting the trackers that feed the carrier killers, each side's opening salvos aimed at eyes rather than hulls, space filling with debris and dazzle in the first hours, the electromagnetic spectrum turning to mud. The side whose web degrades more gracefully keeps its 90 seconds. The side whose web shatters falls back to lone platforms, 25-mile horizons, and 1,982 mathematics against 2,030 missiles. That is why this episode had to come second in the season, before the Taiwan episode, because the public debate about a Pacific war obsesses over platforms, how many carriers, how many ships. And the platforms are not the war. The war is the web. Ships are where the web keeps its missiles. It is worth pausing on the Allies again, concretely this time, because the web's reach in Asia is being extended right now through some of the least publicized and most consequential agreements in modern defense. Japan operates its own Aegis destroyers, is buying SM-6, and has co-developed interceptors with the United States for 2 decades. Its ships already speak substantial pieces of the American network's language. Australia, through AUKUS and parallel programs, is fielding Aegis in its new destroyers and hosting American force posture that includes the sensors and relays the Pacific Web depends on. South Korea's fleet carries Aegis as well. In kill chain terms, this is not diplomacy, it is architecture. Allied radars becoming nodes that thicken the picture across the first island chain. Allied cells becoming magazine depth America cannot carry alone. Allied geography hosting the ground stations and runways the mesh requires. The integration is harder than the communiques imply, and the friction is instructive. Every nation holds its own release authority, its own rules of engagement, its own political thresholds, and a web that fuses sensors in milliseconds still waits on cabinets to decide whether their ships may shoot. Data sharing runs into classification walls decades old, systems built for American eyes only being pried open clause by clause. And the adversary studies the seams deliberately, because a coalition web that fractures politically fails as completely as one jammed electronically. The optimistic reading is that the exercises keep getting more serious. Live intercepts on shared queues, tracks passed across national systems in seconds, problems surfacing in rehearsal instead of war. The realistic reading is that the coalition kill web is a work in progress, racing a timeline nobody controls. Episode 9 returns here through AUKUS. For now, note the principle. In the Pacific, alliance is not a treaty. Alliance is bandwidth. There is one more adversary of the chain we have not named, and it is the least dramatic and most reliable one: friction, the ordinary failure of complicated things. Salt air corrodes waveguides. Software baselines mismatch after a shipyard period. A technician misseats a card and a data link drops for an hour. A satellite ground station loses power in a storm. Sailors are tired, parts are back-ordered, the contractor's field engineer is on the other ship. None of this is enemy action, and all of it does what enemy action does: it slows the chain. Peacetime metrics flatter every military system because peacetime is when the system is newest, fullest, and least stressed. The 90 seconds this episode celebrates is a demonstrated capability, real and repeatable, but it is a best case, achieved by worked-up crews on maintained ships with functioning links. War is the systematic removal of best cases. The honest way to think about the chain, then, is not as a stopwatch number, but as a distribution. On the best day, 90 seconds. On an average day at sea, with a link degraded and a radar in maintenance, longer. On the worst day, underjamming, with satellites dazzled, tracks ambiguous, and the crew on their fourth alert in 6 hours, the chain may take 5 minutes, or may complete with the wrong target, or may not complete at all. Adversary planners aim to shift the entire distribution rightward, towards slow and wrong. American engineers and trainers work to shift it left and to fatten the reliable middle. Wars between peers are won in that middle, by the side whose ordinary day is better than the other side's ordinary day. It is a less cinematic truth than hypersonic missiles and laser weapons, and it decides more. The Navy that wins the next war will not be the one with the fastest chain in a test. It will be the one whose chain still runs, imperfect but unbroken, on day 40, in the rain, with the B team on watch. So where does the chain go from here? Follow the money moving right now, and 3 destinations are visible. The first is deeper into space, more tranches, more laser crosslinks, missile tracking migrating almost entirely to the proliferated mesh, with the explicit goal that no launch anywhere on Earth goes undetected and untracked from boost to impact. The second is deeper into software, the integrated combat system unifying the fleet's baselines, fusion algorithms absorbing more of the classification and assessment burden, and decision aids compressing the human's 9 seconds into a cleaner, better framed choice rather than removing it. The third is deeper into cheap mass, attritable sensors and shooters multiplying the web's nodes, directed energy bending the cost curve of the engage link, and interceptor production lines, finally, being funded like the war-winning infrastructure they are, with multi-year contracts intended to double and triple output by the end of the decade. Notice what all 3 directions share. None of them is a new ship class or a dramatic weapon. All of them are investments in the connective tissue, the seeing, deciding, and sustaining functions that this episode has argued constitute the actual weapon. That is the quiet revolution in American naval thinking, visible only if you read budgets instead of headlines. The platform age measured navies in hulls and tonnage. The web age measures them in sensor coverage, network resilience, magazine depth, and decision speed. And by those measures, the competition in the Pacific is closer than the hull counts suggest. In both directions, China builds ships faster. America, for now, fuses a picture faster. The next war's opening week will reveal which advantage was real. And the entire purpose of the investment surge underway is to make sure America never has to find out the hard way. Because the chain's highest function was never killing at all. It is convincing the other side's planners, every time they run the simulation, that the first move fails. Pull the threads of this episode together, and the picture is this. The 90-second kill chain is real, demonstrated, and unmatched. A 4-decade engineering project that turned satellites, aircraft, ships, and software into a single distributed weapon that manufactures time and spends it on decisions. It is also mortal. Its links can be jammed, spoofed, blinded, and severed. Its magazines are shallow and its production lines thin. Its speed is being outpaced by weapons designed specifically to compress the human out of the loop, and its integrity depends on a web of allied and joint plumbing that is still under construction. Both things are true at once, and holding both at once is the only honest position. The chain is America's greatest military advantage, and it is an advantage with a shelf life, contested every year by adversaries who have read its architecture like a blueprint of their own targets. For the season's larger argument, carry 3 conclusions forward. First, modern military power is network power. The platforms are expressions of the web, not the other way around. And every episode that follows, submarines, satellites, Taiwan, AUKUS, is a chapter in the web story. Second, speed and depth are different virtues. The Red Sea and Hormuz proved the chain can win every engagement while losing the economics, and the war after next will be won by whoever solves cost per shot, not just time to shoot. Third, the human is still there, at the center of the fastest loop ever built, 9 seconds of trained judgment in a dark room. And the pressure to remove that human is the most consequential open question in military affairs, one this season will meet head-on in Episode 10. The chain finds, fixes, tracks, targets, engages, and assesses. What it cannot do is decide what any of it is for. That remains, for now, ours. 90 seconds. That is how long it took, at the top of this episode, for a flash of heat over the Western Pacific to become a missile climbing off a destroyer's deck, and you now know every gear inside those seconds. The satellite mesh that caught the plume, the Hawkeye that manufactured the time, the network that made one ship's eyes, every ship's eyes, the $4 million missile that hunts on its own, and the lieutenant in the dark room who owns the 9 seconds no machine is allowed to take. You also know the counter-moves, the jammers and the spoofers, the anti-satellite weapons, the hypersonics compressing the clock, the magazines that empty faster than any factory refills them. The most sophisticated kill chain in history, and the most sophisticated effort in history to break one, are being built by the same decade, aimed at the same stretch of ocean. Next Wednesday, we go to that stretch of ocean. Episode 3, Why Taiwan is a Different Problem Than Ukraine. The 14-day window, the geography that cannot be negotiated with, and the operational reality that every simulation of this fight keeps producing, that the side that wins the first 2 weeks wins, and the side that loses them does not get a second chance to feed its kill chain. Everything from tonight, the web, the magazines, the 90 seconds, gets thrown against the hardest scenario on the planet. If this episode earned it, hit like. It genuinely moves the needle for a channel this size. Subscribe if you have not, because this season is one continuous argument, and next week is where it sharpens. And leave a comment with the link in tonight's chain you think breaks first. The satellites, the network, the magazines, or the human. We read every one, and the best answers shape future episodes. This is BattleTech Declassified, Modern Warfare, Explained. Made to listen. No screen required.